The story of Pocahontas, often framed as a romantic tale of love bridging two cultures, has long been woven into the fabric of American history. However, the version most widely known today, particularly the account of John Smith, is rife with embellishments and inaccuracies. To truly understand her life and legacy, it is crucial to peel back these layers of fiction and explore the historical realities of her story. Pocahontas, whose real name was Matuaka, was born around 1596 to Pocahontas, the paramount chief of the Powhatan Confederacy in what is now Virginia. The name, Pocahontas, meaning playful one, or naughty child, was a nickname. The Powhatan people believed that revealing her true name to outsiders could endanger her, a common belief among indigenous cultures that knowledge of a true name could grant someone power over them. One of the most enduring myths is the story of Pocahontas saving John Smith, an English settler, from execution. According to Smith's own account, he was captured by the Powhatans in 1607, and just as his life was about to end, Pocahontas heroically intervened by laying her head upon his. While this narrative has been retold countless times, historians today largely agree that this dramatic rescue likely never happened, or, if it did, it wasn't as Smith portrayed it. There are several reasons to doubt Smith's account. First, he did not mention this supposed life-saving event until years later, in 1624, long after Pocahontas had become famous in England. In earlier writings, he made no mention of the incident, which raises questions about its authenticity. Some scholars argue that what Smith interpreted as a near execution might have been a Powhatan ritual or ceremony, perhaps one meant to symbolically adopt him into the tribe. Additionally, Powhatan oral history does not support the notion of such an intervention. The romantic aspect of the Pocahontas Smith story is another fabrication, as Pocahontas would have been around 11 or 12 years old when she first encountered Smith, who was in his late 20s. Their relationship was not one of love but more likely one of mutual curiosity and cultural exchange. Pocahontas did visit the Jamestown settlement and interacted with the colonists, but there is no evidence of a romantic bond between her and Smith. The real Pocahontas played a different, though still significant, role in history. She acted as an intermediary between her people and the English colonists during a time of escalating tensions. Her frequent visits to Jamestown, which may have involved delivering messages or food, were gestures of diplomacy. Yet, by 1613, Pocahontas's life took a darker turn when she was kidnapped by the English and held for ransom during a period of conflict between the Powhatan Confederacy and the colonists. While held captive, Pocahontas converted to Christianity and was given the name Rebecca. In 1614, she married John Rolfe, an English tobacco planter, which further cemented her role as a symbol of peace between the Powhatans and the settlers. This marriage was not only a personal union but also a political one, fostering a temporary peace known as the Peace of Pocahontas. However, it is important to recognize that this peace came under duress and was shaped by the colonial dynamics of power and control. 1616, Pocahontas, now Rebecca Rolfe, traveled to England with her husband and young son. In England, she was paraded as an example of a civilized Native American, a living testament to the success of colonization. Tragically, she died in 1617 at around the age of 21, never returning to her homeland. Pocahontas's story, though often romanticized and distorted, reflects the complexities of cultural contact, conflict, and colonization. She was a young girl caught between two worlds, used by both the English and her own people as a diplomatic tool in a much larger struggle for power and survival. Before we dive into the intricacies of Pocahontas's life and her role in the history of early American colonization, it's crucial to first understand the context of John Smith and the world of the Jamestown settlers. Pocahontas, or as she would have known her land, Seneca Macaw**, meaning Powhatan's lands, was born into a vibrant indigenous world, a place teeming with life, culture, and political structure. Her father, Pocahontas, was the paramount chief of the Powhatan Confederacy, an alliance of Algonquian-speaking tribes in what is now the Tidewater region of Virginia. The settlers who would forever alter the world Pocahontas knew arrived at Jamestown in 1607, 13 years before the famed Mayflower sailed to Plymouth. Unlike the Puritans seeking religious freedom, the Jamestown colonists were primarily adventurers, mercenaries, and traders, drawn to the New World by the lure of wealth, power, and discovery. Their mission was not merely survival but to stake a claim on behalf of England and extract riches from the land. John Smith, one of these men, was already an experienced soldier and explorer by the time he boarded the ships destined for Jamestown. His journey was anything but smooth. Arrested for mutiny during the voyage, Smith narrowly escaped execution when sealed orders from the Virginia Company revealed that he was appointed as one of the colony's leaders. This last-minute intervention set the course for his involvement in the fate of Jamestown and, later, his famed, and questionable, encounter with Pocahontas. The initial settlement of Jamestown was brutal. Starvation, disease, and the harsh climate decimated the settlers within months. Of the 104 men and boys who landed, more than half perished within the first 5 months. The situation was made worse by the colonists' lack of knowledge about farming in the unfamiliar land and their ill-preparedness for the harsh conditions. Supplies from England were slow to arrive, and the few ships that did make it were often beset by storms, pirates, or other disasters at sea. The settlers found themselves in a precarious position, isolated in a foreign land, reliant on the indigenous peoples whose land they were encroaching upon for survival. Beyond the immediate dangers of hunger and illness, the Jamestown colonists also faced the fact that they were not the first to inhabit this land. They were, in fact, colonizing occupied territory, a reality that would shape their every interaction with the Powhatan Confederacy. The Powhatans were a well-established and powerful people, with a sophisticated system of governance, trade, and agriculture. They initially viewed the English with a mix of curiosity, caution, and potential as trading partners, but relations were fragile from the outset. It was in this context of desperation, disease, and growing tension that John Smith ventured into unexplored territory one day, seeking food and resources to sustain the struggling colony. His journey brought him deeper into Powhatan land, where he encountered one of the many indigenous groups under the authority of Pocahontas's father. It was during this expedition, according to Smith's later account, that he was captured and brought before Pocahontas. Smith's story of what happened next has become legendary, though it remains highly contested. According to his own version, Smith was about to be executed when Pocahontas, the chief's young daughter, intervened by laying her head on his, pleading for his life. This act supposedly convinced her father to spare Smith, creating an early narrative of a young girl bridging the gap between two worlds. However, historians are skeptical of this story, particularly given that Smith did not mention it in his first writings about his time in Virginia. It wasn't until years later that he made the claim, after Pocahontas had become famous in England and her story was widely circulated. Furthermore, many scholars believe that Smith may have misinterpreted a ritual or ceremony. Rather than being an execution, his capture might have been part of a ceremonial adoption into the Powhatan tribe, a diplomatic gesture rather than an act of mercy. The Powhatan people had their own customs for dealing with outsiders, and it is possible that Smith's rescue by Pocahontas was more symbolic than literal. Regardless of the truth behind this famous episode, it is clear that Pocahontas played a significant role in the relationship between the Powhatan and the English colonists. At the time, she was a young girl, likely around 11 or 12 years old, when she began visiting the Jamestown settlement. Pocahontas, as the daughter of Pocahontas, was likely used as a diplomatic emissary, helping to broker peace or convey messages between the two groups. However, it's important to remember that her involvement was shaped by the broader political and cultural forces at play, and she had little control over the events that unfolded. The colonists' struggles continued even after Smith's return, and Jamestown would endure a difficult and bloody relationship with the Powhatan Confederacy in the years to come. Pocahontas, who would later be captured, converted to Christianity, and married John Rolfe, became a symbol of peace and reconciliation between the two peoples, though her life was marked by tragedy and upheaval. John Smith's capture by the Powhatans is one of the most famous stories in early American history, often retold with dramatic flair. According to Smith's own account, after being taken prisoner by a group of Native Americans during one of his exploratory journeys in 1607, he was paraded through several Powhatan villages as a spectacle. Many of the villagers likely had never seen a European before, and Smith, with his foreign appearance and manner, became an oddity worth showing off. Eventually, he was brought before the powerful chief Pocahontas, known to the English as Powhatan, who ruled over a vast confederacy of tribes in the region. It is here that John Smith claims the dramatic event unfolded. In his later writings, he recounts how, just as he was about to be executed, Pocahontas, the chief's young daughter, intervened by placing her head upon his in a gesture of mercy. According to Smith, this act moved the chief, and his life was spared. This story has since become the stuff of legend, often romanticized and depicted as the moment where two vastly different cultures were united by the bravery and compassion of a young girl. However, the authenticity of Smith's account has been called into question by historians for several reasons. One of the most glaring issues is the fact that Smith, in his initial reports sent to England in 1608, made no mention of Pocahontas saving his life. These reports, written shortly after his release, contain detailed accounts of his experiences among the Powhatans but make no reference to any dramatic execution scene or life-saving intervention by Pocahontas. This omission is strange, given that such an event would surely be noteworthy, especially in a letter intended to inform English officials and investors about the colony's status. Even more curious is that Smith published two separate books in the years following his time in Virginia, neither of which mention the supposed rescue by Pocahontas. It wasn't until 1624 to 17 years after the incident that Smith first included the story in his writings. By this time, Pocahontas had become famous in England, having traveled there as a symbol of the civilized Native American after her marriage to John Rolfe. Some historians believe that Smith, knowing of Pocahontas's fame, embellished or invented the story to align with her public image and to further his own reputation. Another reason for skepticism lies in the cultural practices of the Powhatans themselves. Some scholars suggest that what Smith may have experienced was not an actual execution attempt but rather a ritual or ceremonial adoption into the Powhatan tribe. Indigenous peoples often had complex customs when dealing with outsiders, and it's possible that Smith misunderstood or misrepresented the event. What he interpreted as an imminent execution could have been part of a ceremony designed to symbolize his incorporation into Powhatan society. In this context, Pocahontas's involvement might have been a formalized role in the ritual rather than an act of defiance against her father's wishes. Adding to the doubts surrounding Smith's story is his reputation as an embellisher. Throughout his life, he was known for telling grand tales of his adventures, many of which stretched the truth. His accounts of his earlier exploits in Europe and the Ottoman Empire are filled with similarly dramatic rescues by noblewomen, leading some historians to conclude that Smith had a habit of inserting such motifs into his narratives to enhance his image as a heroic figure. The historical record also challenges the romanticized view of Pocahontas as a young woman deeply connected to Smith. At the time of their supposed encounter, Pocahontas was likely only 11 or 12 years old. Her interactions with the Jamestown settlers, including Smith, were probably more diplomatic than personal, as she was the daughter of a powerful leader. Her visits to the English colony, which were likely encouraged by her father, would have served as gestures of goodwill and attempts at maintaining peace during a period of growing tension between the Powhatans and the English settlers. Ultimately, the story of Pocahontas saving John Smith's life is more myth than fact, an account shaped by Smith's personal ambitions and later romanticized in American folklore. While Pocahontas did play an important role in the early interactions between the Powhatans and the English, her life was far more complex than the simplistic and often inaccurate narrative that has persisted for centuries. It's entirely plausible that John Smith misunderstood what was happening during his captivity, especially given the cultural and language barriers between the English settlers and the Powhatan people. At the time of the supposed life-saving intervention, Pocahontas would have been around 11 or 12 years old. It's unlikely that a child of her age and status would have been present at such an important ceremony, whatever its true purpose was. In Powhatan society, significant diplomatic or ritual events were usually the domain of men, particularly elders and leaders. While Pocahontas may have had a role as the chief's daughter, her presence at such an event, especially at such a young age, seems improbable. Moreover, the timing of when Smith chose to tell this story raises serious doubts. He didn't write about the dramatic rescue until 1616, nearly a decade after his encounter with the Powhatans. This just so happens to coincide with Pocahontas's voyage to England, where she was being presented as a symbol of the civilizing success of the English colonists. Pocahontas, now known as Lady Rebecca Rolfe after converting to Christianity and marrying English settler John Rolfe, had become something of a celebrity. Her trip to England was a political gesture, meant to demonstrate the supposed harmonious relations between the Native Americans and the English. For Smith, the timing of this newfound tale of heroism conveniently aligned with Pocahontas's rise to fame. Even more suspiciously, Smith expanded upon the story further in 1624, after both Pocahontas and her father, Chief Powhatan, had died. With the principal figures in the story no longer able to confirm or deny his account, Smith added vivid details, further cementing the narrative of his near death and rescue. This raises questions about whether Smith was capitalizing on Pocahontas's fame and embellishing the story to enhance his own reputation. While the story of Pocahontas saving John Smith is likely a fabrication or exaggeration, there is no denying that she did play an important role in keeping him and the early Jamestown settlers alive. After Smith was released by the Powhatans, Pocahontas continued to visit the Jamestown colony, often bringing food and supplies at a time when the settlers were suffering from starvation. Her efforts were likely part of her father's strategy to maintain peace with the English, who were still seen as potential allies, at least for a time. Following his release, Smith rose to prominence within the Jamestown colony, eventually becoming its president. However, the colony remained in a precarious state. Despite the arrival of around 100 new settlers, life in Jamestown continued to be fraught with challenges. One such incident occurred when, through carelessness, the village was accidentally set on fire. The fire destroyed much of their food supplies and shelters, further compounding the dire situation the colonists faced as winter set in. With freezing temperatures and dwindling resources, the settlers once again found themselves on the brink of disaster. Starvation and illness claimed many lives, and tensions with the Powhatans began to mount as the English encroached further into native lands. Pocahontas's efforts to bring food and aid to the colony during this time likely helped stave off even greater loss of life. While Smith's dramatic rescue story may not be true, Pocahontas's real contributions to the survival of the Jamestown settlers are undeniable. Smith's embellishments may have transformed Pocahontas into a romanticized figure in American history, but the reality of her life was far more complex. She was a young girl caught between two worlds, navigating the power dynamics between her own people and the English colonists. As tensions grew between the two groups, Pocahontas's role shifted, and her eventual capture by the English in 1613 marked a turning point in her life. Pocahontas's role in the survival of the early Jamestown settlers was critical, even if much of the narrative around her has been romanticized. She is said to have visited the settlement every few days, bringing much-needed supplies to the starving colonists. At this time, Pocahontas would have been only around 12 years old, yet she played a pivotal role in bridging the gap between her people and the English. Her consistent efforts to provide food undoubtedly saved many lives, contributing to the fragile peace that existed between the Powhatans and the settlers. It's possible that John Smith, who witnessed the young girl's generosity and social nature, later reflected on these experiences when constructing his own version of events. Over time, Smith may have conflated or exaggerated his memories, embellishing his story of being captured and rescued by Pocahontas. While we may never fully understand his motivations, it's clear that the legend of Pocahontas saving his life was only introduced long after the fact, raising suspicion about its veracity. Still, the real connection between Pocahontas and Smith was significant, even if it didn't take place in the heroic fashion Smith later claimed. Following Smith's release, the tension between the Powhatan people and the English settlers began to ease, in large part due to Pocahontas's role as an intermediary. She became something of an unofficial ambassador, facilitating communication between her tribe and the settlers at Jamestown. Her visits to the fort were frequent, and she brought not only provisions but also a willingness to engage with the English. This marked the beginning of her learning the English language, a crucial step that allowed her to better understand and communicate with the settlers. The connection between Pocahontas and John Smith went beyond simple exchanges of goods. According to later accounts, Smith even began to give her lessons in writing, working together to translate words between English and Algonquin. Their relationship, whatever its nature, was a key factor in the relative peace that followed during this time. Through Pocahontas's efforts, both sides found a way to coexist for a brief period. However, this period of peace would not last long. Tensions between the English and the Powhatan people would eventually boil over as more settlers arrived and encroached further into native lands. But during this early period, Pocahontas's actions were essential in maintaining a tenuous balance. As for John Smith, his time in Virginia was cut short. In 1609, he suffered a serious injury when a gunpowder explosion occurred while he was in a canoe. The injury required immediate medical attention, and Smith was forced to return to England. His departure marked the end of an era in Jamestown, as his leadership had helped stabilize the struggling colony. For Pocahontas, Smith's departure would also signify a shift. Without his presence, her interactions with the settlers became more complicated, and her role within her own tribe began to change. In the years following Smith's departure, Pocahontas's life would take several unexpected turns. She would eventually be captured by the English, converted to Christianity, and marry John Rolfe. Her journey to England in 1616 transformed her into a symbol of the so-called civilized savage in the eyes of the English, but her early years in Virginia, particularly her role in aiding the Jamestown settlers, remain a critical part of her legacy. Though much of the legend surrounding her may be exaggerated or fabricated, Pocahontas's real contributions to the survival of the colony and her efforts to bridge the gap between two vastly different worlds cannot be denied. After John Smith left Virginia, a young Pocahontas was apparently told that he had died. This news had a profound effect on her, causing her to stop visiting the English settlement at Jamestown. Her absence marked a turning point, as she had been a crucial link between the Powhatan people and the colonists, keeping the fragile peace intact. Without Pocahontas's presence and mediation, relations between the two groups began to deteriorate. The settlers, already suffering from internal strife and external pressures, found themselves in an increasingly hostile environment. By 1613, tensions between the Powhatan Confederacy and the English had escalated into outright conflict. The brief period of cooperation and mutual assistance was now a distant memory, replaced by war and suspicion. The harsh winters and repeated bouts of starvation ravaged Jamestown, leaving the colonists vulnerable and desperate. With the arrival of a new governor, Sir Thomas Dale, the conflict between the settlers and the Powhatans intensified. Dale was far less interested in diplomacy than his predecessors and believed that the only way to secure the future of Jamestown was through military force. The English were infuriated by what they saw as Powhatan's refusal to cooperate. The Powhatans, in turn, had captured several English prisoners and seized their weapons, further escalating the situation. The colonists, already weakened by disease, hunger, and the harsh conditions of the New World, found themselves in a precarious position. Supplies were running low, and they were still heavily dependent on the Native Americans for survival. Yet, instead of seeking peace, the English leadership stoked the flames of conflict, convinced that only dominance would secure their colony's future. Desperate for leverage, the settlers devised a plan to strike at the heart of the Powhatan Confederacy by targeting Pocahontas, whom they believed to be the key to breaking Chief Powhatan's will. The English knew that Pocahontas, as the beloved daughter of Powhatan, was of immense value to her father. They hoped that by taking her captive, they could force the chief to negotiate and return the English prisoners, along with the stolen weapons. However, they needed a way to capture her without directly engaging the Powhatans in battle, as the colonists were still too weak to risk an all-out war. To achieve this, the English sought the help of a rival tribe, the Potawatomis, who had long-standing animosity toward the Powhatans. In exchange for an alliance against Powhatan, the English convinced the Potawatomis to lure Pocahontas onto an English ship under the pretense of peace. Believing she was safe in their company, Pocahontas boarded the vessel, only to find herself betrayed and taken hostage by the English. The plan worked perfectly, and the English now had Pocahontas as their prisoner. They believed that her father would be so distraught over her capture that he would quickly accede to their demands. In exchange for Pocahontas's safe return, the settlers demanded the release of the English prisoners and the return of the stolen weapons. However, Powhatan did not immediately comply. He was a shrewd and experienced leader, and while he undoubtedly cared deeply for his daughter, he understood the stakes involved. He knew that if he gave in too easily, it would show weakness and embolden the English to make further demands. For months, Pocahontas remained in captivity as negotiations dragged on, and the conflict between the Powhatans and the settlers continued. During her captivity, Pocahontas's life changed dramatically. While initially taken as a pawn in the English power struggle, she soon became more than just a hostage. She was introduced to English customs, taught the language, and eventually converted to Christianity. It was during this time that she met John Rolfe, a tobacco planter who would later play a crucial role in shaping the future of the Virginia colony. Their marriage, which followed her conversion and baptism, would later be hailed as a symbol of peace between the English and the Powhatans. But the reality was far more complex. Pocahontas's capture and the subsequent peace that her marriage symbolized came at great personal cost to her. She had been used as a political tool in the colonial struggle for dominance over native lands, and her marriage to Rolfe, while presented as a diplomatic solution, marked the beginning of a new era of English expansion. Though her life is often romanticized, Pocahontas's story is one of resilience in the face of profound cultural upheaval, as she navigated the complexities of two vastly different worlds. Much to Pocahontas's dismay, her father, Chief Powhatan, reluctantly agrees to the demands of the English. He releases the English prisoners and returns some of the weapons they had demanded, but the English settlers are dissatisfied with the amount. In their eyes, Powhatan's offering is insufficient, and they demand more. As a result, Pocahontas remains in captivity, caught in the middle of the escalating tension between her people and the colonists. She is moved to the English settlement of Henricus, where she is held as a hostage and kept under close supervision. It is during this time that Pocahontas meets a minister named Alexander Whitaker. He is deeply committed to converting Native Americans to Christianity, and he begins to teach Pocahontas about the Christian faith. These lessons, alongside her interactions with the English, help her improve her grasp of the language. However, Pocahontas's true thoughts and feelings about her situation are unknown. Her perspective, like much of her story, is obscured by the dominance of European accounts. We are left with little more than speculation, as the sources that survive come almost exclusively from the settlers who viewed her primarily through the lens of their own culture and objectives. While in captivity, Pocahontas is baptized, an act that would dramatically alter the course of her life. She takes the Christian name Rebecca, a symbolic transformation that underscores her assimilation into English society. This baptism was not just a religious event, it was also a political one, as the English saw it as a major victory in their efforts to civilize the native population. Pocahontas's conversion and renaming were meant to serve as proof that the native peoples could be integrated into European ways of life. Whether she embraced Christianity willingly or as a means of survival remains a mystery. But what is clear is that her baptism marked a significant shift in her identity, at least in the eyes of the English. A year after her capture, the tension between the Powhatans and the colonists reaches a boiling point. The fragile peace is shattered, and the situation escalates into a violent confrontation between hundreds of Powhatan warriors and the settlers. Both sides are preparing for war, and it seems inevitable that blood will be spilled. However, at the last moment, the English manage to de-escalate the conflict by offering Powhatan a chance to speak with his daughter. Hoping to resolve the situation peacefully, Powhatan agrees, and a meeting between father and daughter is arranged. This meeting does not go as Powhatan had hoped. When he finally speaks to Pocahontas, she is not the obedient daughter he expects to find. Instead, she is enraged, not at her captors, but at her father. According to European accounts, Pocahontas expresses anger toward Powhatan for his perceived neglect and refusal to rescue her. She accuses him of abandoning her, of failing to secure her freedom by giving in to the English demands. It is unclear what exactly transpired during this exchange, but what is certain is that Pocahontas's anger shocked both the Powhatans and the English. Her loyalty, which Powhatan had hoped to rekindle, seemed to have shifted. She had spent a year living among the English, learning their ways, their religion, and their language. By this point, she may have felt caught between two worlds, unsure where her true allegiance lay. This pivotal moment, in which Pocahontas appears to reject her father's authority, marked a turning point in her life. From this point on, Pocahontas's relationship with her people would be strained, and her ties to the English would only grow stronger. Her anger during the meeting with her father suggests a complex emotional response to her captivity and the broader conflict between her people and the colonists. It's possible that she felt abandoned, or perhaps she was trying to secure her own survival in a world that was rapidly changing. Whatever her motives, the meeting between Pocahontas and her father failed to bring about the resolution that Powhatan had hoped for. In the wake of this confrontation, Pocahontas would go on to marry John Rolfe, further cementing her place within the English colony. But her fury at her father, her baptism into Christianity, and her new identity as Rebecca would forever complicate her legacy. Caught between two worlds, Pocahontas's story is one of transformation and tragedy, shaped by forces far beyond her control. While much of her life is filtered through European perspectives, her journey from Powhatan princess to English lady reflects the broader struggles of native peoples during the era of colonization. Pocahontas, deeply hurt by her father's actions, confronts him during their meeting, expressing her dismay that he chose swords, pieces, and axes over her safety. In a moment that would have been shocking to Powhatan, she tells him that she no longer wants to be rescued. Instead, she claims to prefer the colonists, insisting that they love her. Whether these words were born out of genuine belief or the influence of her captivity is unclear, but they mark a clear turning point in her relationship with her people. Pocahontas, the once beloved daughter of the Powhatan chief, now sees herself as more aligned with the English settlers than her own kin. By the time Pocahontas is around 17 or 18 years old, she marries an Englishman named John Rolfe, a union that has been more widely accepted as historical fact than the legendary tale of her supposed love for John Smith. Rolfe, a tobacco farmer, had been living in the colony for several years and was instrumental in establishing tobacco as Virginia's primary cash crop. While the true nature of Pocahontas and Rolfe's feelings for each other remains unknown, there is some evidence to suggest that theirs may have been a genuine relationship. In a letter, Rolfe speaks of his love for Pocahontas, though it is also clear that his marriage to her had significant political and economic motivations. The union between the two was an important diplomatic event, solidifying an alliance of sorts between the English settlers and the Powhatans. Pocahontas's father, Chief Powhatan, surprisingly agreed to the marriage, signaling a brief period of peace between the two sides. This time, known as the Pocahontas Peace, brought a temporary halt to the hostilities that had plagued the region. The marriage served as a symbolic gesture of unity, presenting the possibility of a peaceful coexistence between the Native Americans and the English. However, it is important to recognize that this peace was fragile, and it would not last long after Pocahontas's death. The couple lived together on Rolfe's tobacco plantation, where Pocahontas adapted to her new role as a wife and mother. In 1615, she gave birth to their son, Thomas Rolfe. By all accounts, their life on the farm was one of relative stability, a period during which Pocahontas settled into her new English identity. She was now fully integrated into the English colonial world, living far from her native people and embracing a new way of life. Yet, despite the peace her marriage represented, it was also a time of growing English expansion and encroachment on native lands, setting the stage for future conflicts. In 1616, Pocahontas and her family embarked on a journey to England. This trip was not merely a personal or familial visit but a calculated political move by the Virginia Company. Pocahontas's presence in England was intended to serve as propaganda, a living example of the potential for Native Americans to be civilized and integrated into European society. The Virginia Company hoped to use her as a symbol to attract investors and promote the colonization of the New World. Her marriage to Rolfe, her conversion to Christianity, and her ability to adapt to English customs were all presented as evidence of the success of the colonial project. When Pocahontas arrived in England, she was treated as a curiosity and celebrity. English society was fascinated by her, and she was presented to King James I and Queen Anne as an example of the noble savage who had embraced European ways. The court marveled at her grace and poise, but underneath the spectacle was a more complex reality. Pocahontas's presence in England was deeply tied to the colonial ambitions of the Virginia Company, and she was used as a tool to further their financial and political goals. Despite the glamorous image that was presented to the English public, life in England must have been overwhelming for Pocahontas. She was far from her homeland and her people, surrounded by an unfamiliar culture that viewed her more as an exotic curiosity than as an equal. While her marriage to Rolfe may have been seen as a triumph of diplomacy and cultural blending, it is hard to know how Pocahontas truly felt about her role in this grand colonial narrative. She had gone from being the daughter of a powerful chief to a symbol of English colonial success, with her own identity reshaped to fit the needs of the settlers. During her time in England, Pocahontas was reportedly well received, but the strain of adapting to a new world, combined with the cold and damp climate, took a toll on her health. After a year of being paraded through English society, her life would come to an abrupt and tragic end. In March 1617, as she and her family were preparing to return to Virginia, Pocahontas fell gravely ill. Some accounts suggest that she may have contracted pneumonia or tuberculosis, though the exact cause of her death remains unknown. She died at the age of 21, far from her native land, and was buried in Gravesend, England. Her death marked the end of the brief peace her marriage had symbolized, and in the years that followed, relations between the English settlers and the Powhatans would once again descend into violence. Despite the romanticized legend of her life, Pocahontas's story is one of complexity and tragedy, a young woman caught between two worlds during a time of tremendous change and conflict. The prevailing view of Native Americans in 17th-century England was that they were cruel, savage, and dangerous, uncivilized peoples living in the wilderness. However, when Pocahontas arrived in London, she defied these stereotypes. Adorned with a Christian name and fluent in English, she took the city by storm. Her presence, poised and polished, stood in direct contrast to the preconceived notions of what Native Americans were supposed to be. Pocahontas became instantly more relatable, understandable, and, to the English, she symbolized the possibility of harmony between settlers and the native peoples. To those who viewed her, she was living proof that the so-called savages could be civilized. Pocahontas's arrival in England had a profound effect on those who met her. She was received as a visiting dignitary, and her new identity as Lady Rebecca lent her an air of refinement that impressed English society. The Virginia Company, eager to promote colonization efforts in the New World, saw in her an opportunity to further their goals. They believed that her conversion to Christianity and her ability to assimilate into English culture could persuade potential investors that Native Americans were not only capable of being converted but also of being integrated into colonial society. In a sense, Pocahontas was used as a symbol of the success of the colonization project, a living, breathing advertisement for the New World. To memorialize this triumph, the Virginia Company even commissioned a portrait of Pocahontas. This image, which remains the only contemporary depiction of her from her lifetime, was meant to capture her transformation from Powhatan princess to English lady. The portrait shows her wearing English-style clothing, with her face framed by a rough collar, presenting her as someone who had fully embraced European customs. This visual representation of Pocahontas served as a powerful tool in promoting the idea that Native Americans could be civilized and live peacefully alongside the English settlers. Despite this polished public image, there remain significant questions about how Pocahontas truly felt during this period of her life. As with many aspects of her story, The absence of her personal thoughts and feelings leaves historians to speculate. We have no surviving records of her own words or reflections, and everything we know about her visit to England is filtered through European accounts. What we do know is that she was presented as the ultimate example of a civilized savage, a term that, while offensive by today's standards, was commonly used to describe indigenous peoples who had adopted European ways. One can only imagine the complex emotions Pocahontas may have experienced. She was far from her homeland, paraded before English society as a symbol of colonization's success. She had become, in many ways, a political pawn in a game that was far bigger than herself. Was she content with her role? Did she feel pride in the image she presented, or was she merely surviving, doing what she had to in order to secure her place in an increasingly uncertain world? Unfortunately, we will never know for sure. After her whirlwind reception in London, Pocahontas and her family made plans to return to Virginia. Her husband, John Rolfe, had business interests in the colony, and their young son, Thomas, would need to be raised in the world that Rolfe had worked so hard to establish. Though their time in England had been brief, the family's stay had been strategically important for the Virginia Company's ambitions. Pocahontas had fulfilled her role as an ambassador of sorts, bridging the gap between two vastly different worlds. In March of 1617, the Rolfe family set sail to return to Pocahontas's homeland. It was supposed to be the next chapter in her remarkable life, a return to the place where her journey had begun. But tragically, Pocahontas would never make it back to Virginia. Shortly after the voyage began, she fell gravely ill. Accounts of her sickness vary, with some suggesting that she contracted pneumonia or tuberculosis, while others believe that she may have suffered from an illness related to the climate and her long stay in England. Whatever the cause, Pocahontas's condition worsened rapidly, and she died before the ship could leave the Thames River. She was only around 21 years old at the time of her death, a young woman who had already lived a life of extraordinary upheaval and transformation. Her body was buried in the town of Gravesend, England, where her grave remains to this day. Pocahontas's death marked a profound loss, not only for her family but also for the colonists and the Powhatan people. The peace that her marriage to Rolfe had represented would soon dissolve, and the relationship between the English and the native tribes would once again turn hostile. Her death also raised further questions about her legacy. Had she truly embraced the English way of life, or had she been a victim of circumstance, shaped and manipulated by forces beyond her control? Her short life left an enduring mark on history, but much of that history is a product of European interpretation, leaving the true thoughts, experiences, and identity of Pocahontas largely unknown. Today, Pocahontas's story is often romanticized. Her image used to tell a tale of cultural harmony and understanding. Yet the reality of her life was far more complex. She was a young woman caught between two worlds, used as a symbol of peace and progress in a time of conflict and colonization. Her journey, from the Powhatan village of Werowocomoco to the courts of England, reflects the broader struggles of her people and the profound impact of European expansion on indigenous cultures. Unfortunately, this is where Pocahontas's story reaches its tragic conclusion. Before her ship could even reach the open ocean on its voyage back to Virginia, she became gravely ill. The crew was forced to turn around and return to shore, but despite their efforts, Pocahontas passed away in England at around the age of 21. The exact cause of her death remains a mystery, with theories ranging from smallpox to dysentery. Whatever the illness, it claimed her life far too soon. Despite her brief life, Pocahontas's story endures as a symbol of peace and connection between two vastly different cultures. Her legacy demonstrates how one young woman became integral to the fragile peace between the Powhatan people and the English settlers at Jamestown. Her role as a mediator and the way she bridged two worlds offer a powerful narrative of diplomacy, adaptation, and survival during a time of enormous upheaval. Now, shifting focus to her appearance, we're fortunate to have a contemporary image of Pocahontas, albeit created through an English lens. The most famous depiction of her is an engraving by Simon van de Passé, commissioned during her visit to England. While engravings from this era are not known for their subtlety or precision, This particular one provides valuable insight into how Pocahontas was viewed at the time. The art style can seem somewhat clumsy, with exaggerated features that often make her appear older than she was. Remember, she was only around 20 years old when the portrait was made. What's surprising about the image is that, despite the European tendency to idealize or civilize indigenous figures, the engraving doesn't seem overly stylized beyond her attire. Her facial features, though somewhat heavy-handed in execution, seem natural and reflective of her indigenous heritage, rather than conforming completely to European beauty standards of the time. Her expression is poised, her presence dignified, yet the engraving captures a certain authenticity that makes it a unique historical document. While this portrait gives us a glimpse into how Pocahontas may have looked, it's important to remember that the image is still filtered through European eyes. The portrait was likely crafted with political motives in mind, meant to convey her transformation from savage to civilized in the eyes of the English. Her traditional Powhatan identity was partially eclipsed by her new role as Rebecca, the Christian convert and ambassador of peace. In reflecting on Pocahontas's life, the portrait serves as both a reminder of her remarkable journey and a symbol of how history can shape and reframe a person's legacy. Her story, as told by Europeans, is one of assimilation and transformation, but beneath that narrative lies the more complex reality of a young woman caught between two worlds. The engraving of Pocahontas does indeed reveal some of her Native American features, a reflection of her heritage that remains significant despite the European context in which it was created. This nuanced representation aligns with the observations made by author H.C. Rountree, who describes the Powhatan Indians and their rich cultural practices. Rountree notes that, like many Native American cultures, the Powhatan adorned themselves with clothing, jewelry, and tattoos that were intricately linked to age and gender. These elements were not merely decorative, they carried deep cultural significance, representing status, identity, and even spiritual beliefs. In considering what tattoos Pocahontas might have had during her time, it's important to acknowledge that historical records do not provide a definitive answer. However, we do know that many Powhatan women wore tattoos that could signify various aspects of their identity, including tribal affiliation, achievements, or rites of passage. For my own depictions of Pocahontas, I have chosen to incorporate a tattoo pattern that was fairly common among women of the Powhatan tribe. This choice is an attempt to honor the cultural practices of her people while remaining mindful of the gaps in our historical understanding. When it comes to attire, Powhatan women typically wore deerskin dresses or aprons, garments that were both practical and elegant. These dresses were often decorated with intricate patterns and adorned with shell beads, which were highly valued in their society. Such adornments were not just for aesthetics, they served as symbols of beauty, status, and cultural identity. For my recreation of Pocahontas, I aimed to capture this essence by depicting her in a deerskin dress that reflects the styles of her time, embellished with beads and jewelry that convey the richness of Powhatan culture. Jewelry played an important role in the lives of Powhatan women. They often wore necklaces, bracelets, and earrings, crafted from materials such as shells, stones, and animal bones. These pieces were chosen based on the occasion and the individual's personal style, often enhancing their appearance while carrying cultural meanings. In my interpretation, I've included various pieces of jewelry that might have adorned Pocahontas, considering how these adornments could represent both her identity as a Powhatan woman and her role in the colonial context. Pocahontas's hair was another aspect of her identity that could vary in style. Traditionally, Powhatan women wore their hair long and free, or sometimes styled in a single long braid, allowing for personal expression while adhering to cultural norms. In my depiction, I've chosen to illustrate her hair in a manner that reflects both her youth and the beauty standards of her people. The choice to leave her hair long and flowing honors the traditions of the Powhatan while also allowing her individuality to shine through. Moving beyond the historical context, it's interesting to explore modern interpretations of Pocahontas. In contemporary depictions, there is often an effort to blend historical accuracy with a modern understanding of indigenous identities. This approach seeks to honor Pocahontas not only as a historical figure but as a symbol of resilience and cultural pride. In my modern reinterpretation, I've aimed to create a balance between the historical elements of her identity and the empowering narrative that surrounds her legacy today. This involves integrating traditional Powhatan attire and adornments with a sense of contemporary fashion, allowing for a dynamic portrayal that resonates with both history and modern sensibilities. The modern depiction of Pocahontas serves as a reminder that her story transcends time, embodying the complexities of cultural exchange, adaptation, and survival. Ultimately, the recreations of Pocahontas, both from her own time and in modern interpretations, speak to the enduring nature of her story. They highlight how one young woman can become a powerful symbol of peace and resilience, bridging two worlds while navigating the challenges posed by both cultures. As we reflect on her legacy, it is essential to recognize the layers of her identity and the cultural richness that shaped her life and continues to influence the narrative surrounding Indigenous peoples today. Thank you for joining me on this journey to explore the life of Pocahontas. I hope you found it as fascinating as I did. If you enjoyed this content, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel, as your support helps us continue to bring history to life. We also offer prints and bookmarks of these artworks on our Etsy shop. Check the link in the description below for more details. I look forward to seeing you for our next topic.